Hello and welcome back for the Utility Health series on 2025 prior auth expectations. Today, we're going to be talking more about what payers need to know as they look forward into the year and explore opportunities for automating and creating touchless prior authorization solutions within their organizations. We have Karen Norris of ClearCore Insights with us today, along with Michael Lunzer with Utility Health. I'll let both of you do a little introduction to yourselves before we dive into some of today's topic. Karen, would you like to kick us off?
Hi, I'm Karen Norris. I'm CEO of ClearCore Insights. Our business is to help healthcare payers improve technology implementations with readiness, with clarity, and with success by up to 95%.
Awesome. And Michael, can you tell us a little more about you?
Sure. Hello, I'm Michael Lunzer, CEO and founder of Utility Health. I'm a serial entrepreneur, so my background is spending a lot of time applying technology to business problems, and excited to talk with everybody today about Utility Health and our effort and focus is really to streamline and automate prior authorizations for payers, which in effect means that we focus on delivering all parties, all constituents, a much better prior authorization experience.
Great. Today, we're talking more about the challenges that payers face in the prior auth landscape and some of those solutions that they might find to solve those challenges. But before we dig into what those look like, Michael, can you give us a little introduction to the state of prior auth and what's been happening in the industry as it relates to prior authorization?
Sure. It's really an exciting time for the people that work in utilization management and prior authorization um, processes. We're kind of coming to the peak of a number of different initiatives and things that are driving change. So first of all, everybody in the industry has known for a long time that prior authorization is way too reliant on manual processes and ultimately fax machines. So there's been a strong desire to see change in this marketplace for a long time. Some of the other areas of improvement in healthcare have seen much more mature evolutions of their processes. And so it seems like from one perspective, the time is now for prior authorization because so many other things are brought up to a reasonable level of maturity and prior auth is way behind. So that's one element that's driving this perfect moment in time. Another significant element is cost pressures. Payers and providers are under tremendous pressure to reduce cost. We've also seen with COVID the dramatic additional burden and pain that the provider community's gone through that has created a need for efficiency on the provider side of the aisle and really across both sides of this equation. And that's ultimately kind of driven a cost-based pressure, right? So the time is now because of just maturity of the process, but also because cost is there's an opportunity to save money, and payers and providers are looking to drive down cost. There's another significant pressure that's taking place right now, which is all of the regulatory change. We've seen state governments propose and pass various regulations that are driving change in prior authorizations, things like gold carding and shorter turnaround times and requirements for certain experts to be a part of the process. And then in addition, now, of course, the federal government's gotten involved, and we've seen CMS passing interoperability requirements, and prior authorization is probably one of the most exciting of those interoperability opportunities because both payers and providers are looking forward to seeing that change. It will help both of them. And then, lately we've even seen social pressure, as we've seen from the social media and other areas. There's a lot of pressure on health insurance companies to do a better job, and this is one of those areas that can definitely help patients and providers and the marketplace to feel a better experience. So it's kind of all of those elements wrapped up into one have caused a huge surge of activity in this area and need and desire for change.
That was very helpful. Thank you so much for the overview. Karen, your team has hosted a series of forums with payers to help identify some of the challenges that they face in the prior auth landscape. Can you tell us a little more about the challenges that you've identified as part of those forums?
Yeah, so we, in working with these health plan leaders and decision makers, we've actually hosted a series of executive forums, or we call them virtual conversations, around really collaborating, talking about the issues, finding out what other health plan organizations are doing to address these, and what we focus on are really areas of urgency. So the ones we did in the latter part of 2024 were around CMS. The real urgency of the CMS mandate. What were these decision makers working on? Was it of importance to them? What were some of the areas that may have been concerned for them? And so they're just really nice collaborative conversations and a very open forum. So it's not intended from a just internal. It gives people the kind of sense that they can be open and talk about some of their concerns. And so some of the challenges that really came up when we do polls throughout these virtual conversations so that we can share and discuss what those concerns are. So some of those concerns were really, and I think that what Michael's talking about now is there's a little bit more attention. This was, in 2024, but it was around really the lack of sense of urgency, right? And I have to be honest, I still see it out there. I think that it's seen as a future thing, and not as much urgency. Maybe the interop part is, but really the benefits, the organizations and the health plans. But there's that urgency, the concerns about resource constraints and the rising costs of expert resources to be able to address this. We have the over-reliance on vendors was also a concern that came up. A lack of stakeholder engagement and real accountability is a one owner. So that's always an ideal. As a person that does implementations, I want to find who's that owner and help them take accountability, especially when working within their organization with other software vendors to really deliver. So those are kind of the key things that came up as a common challenges.
And thinking about that, was the scope of implementation for what needs to be in place for some of those mandates or to achieve a truly touchless prior authorization solution, was that a concern as well?
Not at that time. I really, and it continues to be conversations, honestly. So this year, I've been speaking to health plan leaders and decision makers, as well as some of the software vendors that have care management platforms. And they're not seeing the level of urgency from their health plan organizations. Now, they may be looking for different solutions that get them there quicker and more accurately, like utility health, but they're not really investing, like working closely with their vendors, which has always been the case, actually. It's always, coming from the vendor space. That's where I was for 30 years. Yeah, that's always been the case. Really understanding and kind of pushing your vendor a little bit. I'm talking about the platform vendors, the care management software vendors, and other vendors that are there as well, and really making them accountable. But I think that where we're going now is in terms of the challenges again that continue to be, where are these health plans directing their attention? Where are they focusing their energy? And how are they going to continue to address? But I'm not really seeing a lot in the prior auth space. I think what I continue to see is more the interoperability, the technology component. Everyone seems to think it's an IT thing, and so that's continuing versus which I find kind of disappointing is what Michael's talking about is the level of optimization and automations and accuracy and analytics you can get out of this if you pay attention to the business side. And it's operations always owns this. They're the owners, they're the business owners, and they're the ones that are going to be held accountable. And so that's where I think, we're not seeing that level of engagement, process improvement, automation, using, some automated, capabilities that will really help improve their efficiencies. And to Michael's point, it's probably going to come too far, too late. And then organizations are going to be reluctant to invest. And that's what I found in implementations. You get to go live, and all of a sudden it's very difficult to get the funding needed to actually invest. And over time you do, but it takes a lot longer.
Is there a lack of full understanding of of what these prior auth APIs are all about and what they're designed to do from a benefit perspective to the payer?
I think that's you're spot on. That's actually an excellent point because there is a lack of education. What I do hear is, oh my, I should be reading this reg, I should be learning it more. And these are individuals that are running clinical operations, right? We really want to dig in. And again, there seems to be this deferral to IT, which is, how can you bring back? And so education, I think, would be an awesome approach to kind of address it, to help them understand the benefits and some of the things they could do now, like process improvement, streamlining the PAs now, would be very beneficial.
So it's interesting. I guess hadn't thought about this, but I think what you're saying is that they're seeing that the requirement for the standard requires an API. And when they hear API, they assume that that means the IT department creates an API, but it doesn't necessarily indicate, the words API don't necessarily indicate the level of process improvement that comes along with
That's right.
the implementation of those APIs, both within transactions that come through the API, but also the kind of process improvement that comes along with the infrastructure they need to have in order to support the API.
No, you're right. What I've found over the years of working with implementing technology is when you do it right, you start the business process reengineering is something you start very, very early, and then you start taking the capabilities as you're building out your to-be states. You're using the capabilities of the platform, right? And in this case, it's APIs. How can I take what I'm getting now and create the capabilities to really improve and really take advantage of what's available versus, this is the way we do things, and therefore I'm just going to adapt and do workarounds or customizations and things like that without adapting. And there's I can't tell you many implementations that organizations do not want to invest in it, or we're not working with the experts that know how to do it really right.
Something that jumps out at me from what you're saying is that when these APIs is really the main requirement that comes out of CMS for this prior authorization change. But when these APIs were designed, there were a lot of business and technology people that spent a lot of time thinking about this from a process reengineering perspective. And their thought process was, what should this process look like from end to end? And then within that scope, they designed an API, application programming interface, that the payer would need to have and that the provider would need to have, and all the systems and capabilities to support those APIs. And then what we ended up with is a regulation that says the payer needs to deliver this API. But if the participants don't recognize the context of what that API is designed to deliver end to end and the value that that can bring, unfortunately the benefit of the API can be lost by just trying to just do the API. And that would be really unfortunate because the cost of just doing the API already includes many of the things that health plans can really benefit from with other infrastructure components that they're going to have to do anyway. So why not get the value out of all of those components?
I agree. It's just I'm not seeing it. That's all right now. I think it may come just too late in the process when the organizations are really just focusing on the big component, which you call with the APIs, versus how can I look back. Many of these care management platforms have been highly customized over time versus using the inherent capabilities of those. And so, how do you back out of those? And many need optimization, for example. And it's a perfect opportunity to go through a really good exercise or initiative to really take a step back and look at your current states and review them, not only in terms of helping improve the care management platform that likely many will have to upgrade to anyway to be compliant, and or at least to get the next version where the vendor is compliant, and then you have the other layer on it, and how do you get to that? So I don't know that many. I think to your point is it's almost like a training opportunity. Can you get organizations out there to think differently? And their heads are spinning today with so many other priorities. What's the most important thing? I think, as you mentioned before, with COVID and last year, I was finding a lot of health plans were really their expenses were increasing pretty rapidly, so things got deferred. And it's like, do we really need to do this, right? And so it's really what the understanding is, with a sense of just being, I think, just intelligent about it. I get it. I'm not trying to diss anybody, but just really think about it. What's the best thing I could do when we're actually given the opportunity to do this? And at the end of the day, you're going to get huge ROI out of it in many ways.
It's interesting you say it. Do I really have to do this? Um, because when I think about the benefits that payers and providers and members ultimately get from this, everybody wins financially. Everybody wins from many efficiencies perspective. They should be looking at this from the perspective, do we really get to do this? Is this really real that this is actually going to happen? Because when they do execute this effectively, when the industry really focuses in on this capability, there's going to be so much additional benefit that comes from it. We talked a little earlier before our conversation here that one of the real big benefits of this process is that in order to build an API or a system to system interface, one of the things that needs to happen is we need to standardize or at least codify all the rules in some kind of a system that can participate in an electronic interchange. And spreadsheets and PDFs today are not going to support that, right? So once we codify all this information, we create a cleaner process. The provider doesn't submit prior auths that don't need prior auth because they're not using a fax machine. They're submitting data that the health plan can process efficiently. And that ultimately means that the data and the interaction that the payer gets is cleaner. And that means they can process it faster. And it also means that because it's all clean, the payer can do analytics and really get knowledge about what's happening in these transactions, which will allow them to perfect the whole process. So it's this cascading snowball effect of benefit that everybody gets to take advantage of. And the investment that a health plan needs to make, in this case, I think gets to make, is some investment in technology and structure that will yield results, many times over in a snowballing value proposition.
You bring up a great point. I think in addition, it just dawned on me when we're working with organizations that are doing implementations, care management initiatives, for example. One of the resistance areas to most of the organizations is really embracing change management. So I'm thinking about kind of the people side, right? The people side of change. And there is a resistance within the care management arena, for the most part, that is resistant to changing anything they've done before. So in addition to really streamlining your processes and really adapting to your future state, not only with streamline opportunities, different ways of doing business and being more efficient, as well as the API efficiency, there's always a resistance. There's a resistance to change. And so, that's, I think I would just, it was a thought. I was like, I would almost want to embed that as part of a process, an educational process, because it really is, it's a massive change the way you speak about it. It's massive. And how can these organizations really benefit or understand it's a benefit versus, oh my gosh, I have to do this, right? It's mandated, I have to do it and do MVP, minimal viable product, versus, my gosh, I have an opportunity to just revolutionize my own department and gain those efficiencies. And that gives me leverage and probably likely more investments from the organization to do some really innovative things in their organizations that they can't do today, right? To really help improve the members' care, really help improve the relationships with their providers, and actually achieve great savings in that process. So it's more of it's very big. It makes me think more about it in that relatively, that discussion.
What what do you think is the difference between organizations that embrace this kind of change and those that are resistant? Are there common threads between the two types of organizations that are there things I guess managers can do to turn their culture a little bit more towards innovation?
Yeah, culture is the spot. You're spot on. I would have said culture right away. I mean, every organization comes with their culture. It could be a culture of, trust or lack of trust. It could be a culture of innovation. It could be a culture, it's from the leadership of how are they transforming their own organizations. And so it really is pretty endemic across an organization of how the overarching leadership is. And I've seen organizations where there is a trust issue, trust in their teams, trust in just letting their own teams innovate and do interesting things because it's not the way it's done, et cetera. But I think it just really makes me keep on thinking more about this is that there's a different message out here, which is, how can these organizations, overcome culture barriers and really embrace a very different, instead of this is mandated and I must do it, I'm going to get there by hook or by crook, and that's going to be a lot of the health plans versus how can I invest a little dollars now and really just achieve something that's really very, very different for organization. And the leaders that are running these operations will really be seen as really more as innovators than they are going to be as laggards, right? So that's what would be really good. Not to say that it's so easy to do that, but it's a good message in terms of getting out there.
And what's interesting about that is that the investment in a minimal implementation of the CMS standards is the same investment that if they want to do things effectively, right? There's not a lot of additional investment because in order to support the APIs, there are minimal things you have to do. So why not do those things proactively with an eye towards how they're going to benefit you rather than just a minimum investment?
I think for sure. I think, when you're talking to them specifically, and again, when I think about it, I relay this as a technology initiative, right? It's technology. It's an implementation of a technology solution or solutions to meet this mandate, right? So it's really that. And so my eyes are always thinking about, after I've been doing implementations for over 50 payers, in my career, or even more so in very different technology, it's like you tend to always see the same, like very similar approaches and similar thoughts, and how organizations will not think early enough on, or early enough on that I would really love to see them do that, is to say, how ready are we for something? What really needs to get done? How can I do the best thing, get the best outcomes? How do I create KPIs or success factors early on? How do I see the end in mind early on, as early as possible? And it's not often done because of the way implementations are structured, and working with some of these organizations, it's kind of like get it in there, and then after the fact they start struggling, or doing then you start struggling, and then you start losing, how do you control the process, and then did I get what I really wanted? So it's really good for an organization, with this particular mandate. It'd be great to sit down with an organization and say, let's do a strategy around this. These are all the components of it. Now let's talk about it. If you can have the best thing ever, what would that look like? And then kind of back into at that point, right? I mean, automation or, accuracy and quality could be a very big thing and could drastically reduce, operational cost. And also, you think of downstream like appeals, and, how sophisticated the appeal process has gotten. And so all of a sudden, the more accurate you are and the more information you give the provider, it's a downstream, right? And so you're not investing it, and the appeal process could be extremely difficult. I've done a lot of appeals and grievances work. And so it's, there's all these other things that you can avoid, right? And so if you really thought about upfront, and, we kind of specialize in assessments. And so, I wish I would see more organizations really, especially there's so many massive like regional health plans, and we're not looking at the big guys, right? We're looking at the number out there that are under 1 million lives, 500,000 lives, et cetera. There's a massive amount of health plans that are going to be affected, and there's really a lot of small Medicare Advantage plans as well, right? There's a lot of startups. There's a lot of smaller plans that have really invested, in this. And then if you even look at some of the plans that could probably help improve their own stars ratings, because there's always that's happening with some MA plans that have very low stars. Now you've got a lot of more accuracy, and it's a component of the stars, right? But it's really important. It's how they're driving their own business.
So we've talked a lot about the challenges that are slowing down the timeline for implementation or stopping payers from moving forward, but we have not talked about what the timeline actually is for them to implement a solution. Can you share a little bit more?
So yeah, for the timeline for implementation, I'd say there's it's not as going as quickly or as, so one of the things I've been kind of shouting out is, it would be awesome if you could have everything implemented Q1 of 2026, everything, right? And I think Michael's seen it with some of his clients. So what it's like, if you can do it by then, that gives you enough time to test it, because in implementations, testing is one of the most looked over. It's dropped more quickly. You go live without the adequate testing. It happens all the time, and you start having all kinds of defects and things happen. Now you've got to dial back, and your post implementation stabilization period gets longer, for example. So the goal as a timeline would be get everything in by Q1 of 2026, whether that's realistic or not. But that gives you, probably a 12-month, time frame right now, and that's pretty aggressive, I think, given, and also, especially if you're talking about interoperability as well, it's a pretty aggressive timeline for where these organizations are. They're out there. You're seeing software vendors in the space that are still just really now starting to push their capabilities. I mean, if there's the ones out there doing RFPs and things like that, they're certainly rising to the top, but it's really hard to get someone to push and say, let's look at what your plan of action is outside of interop. And interop is probably going to go through Q4 of 26, right? I mean, for most organizations. So yeah, I mean, the plans are pretty nebulous right now, just because I think the business side has not, for the most part, has not been as engaged as they could be.
Yeah, it's fascinating to hear your thoughts, kind of concurring with ours that from a health plan perspective, if they're just getting started now, being implemented in 12 months is a fast timetable. There are a couple other critical elements of this equation, one of which is you need to find a vendor that can actually support this initiative. Some organizations are looking at their platform vendor as the vendor of choice for this.
Yep.
What we know is that most of them don't have solutions yet today. They're just getting started on some of those components. Um, so if your vendor isn't there yet, how can you get there in 12 months as a payer? And then the other element of this is the fact that we estimate somewhere around 400 health plans that need to implement these interfaces in the next year and a half, almost just short of 2 years, right? And there's only so many of us vendors and so much of our time that they can get from us.
Okay.
And I think a lot of health plans are maybe counting on the new administration to back off on the timetable.
Yep.
The reality is that this is the organization that proposed these regulations originally. And I've talked to some who are part of the incoming administration in healthcare, and their perspective is that prior auth innovation can't come fast enough, that we're behind. So I wouldn't be surprised to see the incoming administration push payers and providers harder in this particular category because of the social pressures around this, if nothing else. So I think we're headed for a really big reckoning for health plans in this area that wait. And again, what's really unfortunate is doing things now is hugely beneficial. And I'll go deep on the specifics for a second, but one of the key things in the APIs that's required is the ability to share your prior auth rules over a CRD application programming interface. In order to do that, you can't have a spreadsheet that owns your rules. You need a system. And the great news is that system can also be used on your portal and improve process for all of your existing pay providers today, even without this new thing. And it saves more money than the cost of implementation of these tools. So it's kind of it's a surprising thing that you're as a payer, their back's against the wall. They need to
Mhm.
do this. There's a risk that they might be in trouble if they wait, and there's a huge incentive to move now. Um, so that's the message we're trying to get out there to people, and hopefully they're getting that message because it's a huge opportunity, and boy, to wait would be a really bad thing. If a small payer gets started in 2026 working on this, they're really in serious jeopardy of not being able to get those APIs in place. And again, we don't know what's going to happen with the regulation, but I wouldn't be surprised if there are stronger penalties put in place for
Mm.
not complying because of the social pressures and it's a ubiquitous pressure. AMA and their fixed prior auth now website has gotten tremendous traction. There's lots of states that are putting pressure on payers. And then what's the risk if we aren't successful implementing these strategies? I believe that the federal government may come in and push even more punitive measures on payers. Have you talked to any payers that have any concerns about that from a regulatory perspective, or how are they seeing the regulatory expectations?
Yeah, I mean, what I'm hearing is something that you're talking about because there's been such swift and rapid things happening in government very quickly that why would this one be ignored? But you talk about CMS expecting $15 billion in savings over 10 years, right? And that's certainly a very big interest to the current administration, right? And to your point, it's like the value also is that the providers stand to just gain a great deal of value and also reduce the friction and abrasion that happens today. And so the benefits, I think, far are outweigh. And I certainly would like to see it go through and not get delayed. But I do believe that some of the organizations are kind of counting on it. That's what I've heard. And so I said, coming from the vendor space, and talking to some of these vendors now, just connecting with them that have care platforms, not your solution, but the management platforms, their interoperability isn't very good, and they're the first to admit it, even though they still say they're interop, but they're really not. It's not a
Right.
solution. And you have some of the organizations as well. And I have a point here is that they're waiting on their vendors to help them. And the vendors, this is the vendors will have the product capabilities available and maybe some consulting, but the vendors, it's so vast. It's just not a vendor, right? It's many components of it. So it is a health plan's responsibility. And one of the things that I found over time is where we really strive is to really get these organizations accountable and actually actively engaged, right? And so, rather than don't rely on your vendor, it's always a big thing with us. And so, and I think there's a hedging going on, right, which could be even more disastrous. Again, I think that to your point, the small health plans they're going to be driven. They're not going to be able to do because they don't have the money available. And as less and less resources become available, or the qualified resources become available, all these organizations out there, they're going to start demanding really high fees for their consultants and others that are in this. And so, but again, I'm looking in the future, what you and I can see, right? I was talking to an SVP couple weeks ago. And I asked him, I was like, and he's in the technology piece. And I said, so what are you doing for the CMS 57? He's like, and I get silence. I get silence that, I don't know, somebody else is doing it. I'm like, okay. So those are kinds of answers you get. I mean, like no one's really talking about it, right? And to your point, it's going to get to a place like probably mid-year or something, and then panic is going to set in, right? Just like,
Right.
what do we do? How do we? So I think what's interesting, what you're talking about is, and it's going to help probably my messaging as well, is like, how do you get the dialogue more in front of these business owners and the ones that are ultimately, they are the accountable owners at the end of the day, and they may be the owners by default, but they will be the owners, right? And so
Right.
it's hard for IT to say, we're just supporting you operations. Like, what are you doing and how are you achieving this? So I think it's an important message, and I think urgency is there. I'd like to see more of it, actually.
If a payer has not chosen a solution and they're hearing these timelines that the two of you are discussing, what do they do now? How do they choose a solution? How do they fast track that decision? And how do they make sure that they have not only a solution that provides the right ROI, but helps them gain compliance before the deadline?
I'll take a stab at that. So, and my response is going to be really different than Michael's, I would suspect, because I'm coming from a implementation perspective. So if they haven't chosen a solution, I take it step backwards even, and you'd have to do some, I call it a rapid response reset, which is cut to the chase. Really, just you really have to understand what you have internally and your processes that Michael referred to before, kind of your real end to end. And if you haven't done that, you really should probably conduct a really high level assessment, a really quick. Just don't, it's not going to be, it doesn't have to be in, an 8-week, it could be a, 4-week assessment, really high level, really dig in as quickly as possible, identify your gaps. Where are your gaps, right? Using expertise or the folks in your organization that are really close to us to find out where are my gaps. So like, what if I have prior authorizations that are creeping up to the 14-day mark? That's a gap. And right. And so how do I address that? And so you look at, is there a solution to do this versus do I hire, 1,000 more nurses, for example, or ship it overseas or something, so it's like that could be a gap for an organization, for example, but go through and say, what are those basic tenets of the mandate, and just kind of determine where those gaps are and then start addressing to close those gaps, at least the highest ones. If you haven't done anything yet, and also say to address from a solution perspective, you're getting past the build right now. You're going to have to buy. There are organizations that probably would have thought about building, and there's probably organizations that have care management platforms that are internal and proprietary that may not be sufficient for to meeting what this is, and how do they build that up. But more importantly, it's just like, if I have gaps and I'm having issues with my API vendor, or how do I find those vendors, right? Michael, he can share about how you go about finding vendors. But my point is, like, I start everything. I highly recommend an assessment. Just get your gaps, and then start, how do I close each one of those gaps? And the other thing to do is also, and it's hardly ever done, is risks. What are my risks if I don't do this? That's a really, what is my risk, and how do I create a mitigation, which is also a gap closure.
That's really good. It's interesting because I think from a bit of a technologist's mindset about the process, but ultimately it's very similar in that, first identify what is your process today? What are the components? And I think when we talk to executives at health plans, they don't know the details of how much of this works. And the lower level, the people that are processing these processes, they do know all the components, and they can probably tell you where their components are short, what their shortcomings are, but there isn't the conversation that takes place there, right? But if a health plan can document their process, I think it becomes really obvious some of the things that need to change. Kind of back to what I mentioned earlier, that they use spreadsheets to communicate rules, and most health plans do not have a source of truth for prior auth rules. Those prior auth rules are buried in multiple different systems and ultimately end up in claim systems, but claim systems aren't meant to communicate rules. So,
Yeah.
so there are these core things that they need to have in order to build out this true capability for these APIs. And those core systems, for instance, the ability to have rules in a system, bring lots of other benefits. So it's if they can first understand what are their gaps from a connectivity perspective to get to those APIs, then it becomes much more obvious what they need to go find to fill a gap. And whether that's the build or buy, or something their existing vendor has, making sure they understand the things that they need to go shopping for, because most organizations don't know that. And another thing I guess I would start with too is, what are we trying to accomplish? So start with, what does our process look like today? And in a perfect world, what should it look like? And what are the gaps between here and there? Not just what do we need to do to get the API to work, but what is the ultimate solution? And maybe you don't buy and implement the ultimate all features today, but at least if you have an idea of where you're going and what you want to get to, it's much easier to evaluate vendors against the long-term vision rather than just what I need to do today. Because it would be a shame for people to spend, the same amount of money with different vendors, with two different vendors. You could spend the same amount of money. One of them will get you an MVP that you can use today that will be throwaway in 2 years when you want to improve. The other vendor will get you up and going on compliance, but also give you a nice pathway to continue to mature and ultimately get to the future state that you really want. And
Like,
another thing that
there's
I'll
a,
say is a
there's a
commercial
great
for
policy of,
Karen that hire Karen, right? Get a
that's right,
consultant
hire Karen.
to
That's
help
right.
you
She loves
do this
assessment. She loves
do this
assessment.
assessment, right? The assessment is a great starting point.
And I've asked, I have approached organizations, starting last year. It was kind of like what you did. It's like, what hill you choosing to stand on. And so it was, trying to get that message out. And there was really no level of interest or, just really thinking about it because everyone was trying to jam through 2024 and get the things they needed to get done. The level of activities on their plates was huge, in addition to their day jobs, et cetera. And so now it's just like, I would love to see them do, end-to-end current state assessment, gather all of the process flows, gather all of the policies, gather every you could. Now, it may not be possible because that takes a little time, but but where could you, if you're looking at places where you're doing a lot of manual work around, if we get back to prior authorizations, many of these platforms and the requirements of these organizations, the health plans, they'll drop to manual procedures, they'll drop to workarounds, they'll drop to a lot of things that they can get immediate efficiencies from. They're dropping to your point, Excel spreadsheets or or some other report that gets generated because they don't have the optimization within the platform now. And if you could remove some of that, not worry so much about the platform itself, with other solutions that kind of get you there, then that's it, and you don't have to go through that massive pain of kind of re-implementing of technology. There is a true benefit in being able to achieve that. And I do think more about, how do you get these organizations to understand the value, rather than it being like, a penalty, that they're being penalized, right?
I'd just like to say thank you, Karen, for the opportunity to talk today, and thank you, Courtney, for emceeing the conversation. I think this was a great conversation, and we look forward to talking with health plans and consultants and Karen much more with organizations that are going to do some exciting things in the near future.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Courtney, as well, for your work in getting this together. I think I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about these topics, and we went some really great and interesting directions that I certainly wasn't anticipating. But I'm fairly passionate about helping these organizations really be successful, and I always like to determine that I'd like to see them suffer less, right? And so it's nice collaboration, kind of talking, we're actually talking from the same place. It's just kind of different perspective. And I appreciate the opportunity because I really do enjoy it. Thank you.
Great. Awesome. Thank you.
Thanks, guys. Have a good rest of your day.
Thank you. Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.